Good evening. I'm Ivan Canada, Executive Director of NCCJ, and on behalf of NCCJ's staff and Board of Directors, thank you for joining us tonight for part 2 of this 3-part series on the question of how do we talk about racism and community policing. The timing of these programs is directly related to last week's verdict in the Chauvin trial for last year's murder of George Floyd. But of course, the impact of bias and racism on law enforcement and other systems that govern our communities isn't a new problem. In one sense, this conversation is not much different from the ones that so many of us have been having for years and months, and for others, even decades. At the same time, I realize these conversations feel new and shocking to folks who are just now becoming aware of these issues. And that's what makes this conversation different. We're living in a time of increased awareness around these issues. And because of that, we need to think about our perspective. And because of the fact that unequal outcomes and disproportionate impact impact Black and Brown people experience when they come into these systems. More of us are paying attention. More of us are looking to our leaders for answers. These are big and decisive issues, but we're not here tonight to talk about them on a big national or global scale. We're here to talk to them about how they're playing out at the local level, right here in our own community. We at NCCJ hope for a community where every single person feels safe, protected, and respected during encounters with law enforcement officers. And we hope for a community where law enforcement officers are given holistic training and the support that they need to effectively protect, serve our community and go home at the end of each day. I'm willing to bet that you hope for a community that's like that as well. So how do we get from here to there? NCCJ doesn't claim to have the answers. We can't heal this pain or solve these problems, but we can take part in finding solutions to break this cycle of violence and injustice. The way that we're doing that is by bringing people together to have respectful conversations. That's because NCCJ does not focus on policy or advocacy. Many wonderful groups and organizations are already doing that important work. What we are is a bridge building organization. NCCJ is focused on helping people communicate respectfully with one another to find common ground and achieve solutions that will benefit all of us and not just some of us. Policing is a complex topic, and we can't expect simple answers or easy solutions to these problems. Like all systems, police departments are made up of individuals, human beings who have unique identities, experiences, and perspectives, just like you and me. It is essential that we keep talking and that we don't shy away from difficult or painful topics as we search for real solutions to the serious issues that we're grappling with as a community. It's also essential that we have these conversations, that we don't forget to see each other as complete, complex human beings. So with that in mind, let's continue the conversation that we had on Tuesday, where we heard from 4 grassroots community organizers about the work that they're doing to create more equitable outcomes and about their ultimate goals for police reform and community safety. We're thrilled to have 2 of Greensboro's most well-known leaders join us for tonight's conversation, as well as friends, Mayor Nancy Vaughan and Police Chief Brian James. Will you all introduce yourselves and share a little bit about how you got to Greensboro and some of your connections here? And lastly, how you and why you decided to go into the field of work that you're in. Mayor Vaughan, we'll start with you.
Good evening. It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. And I enjoyed the panel discussion on Tuesday as well. And I hope that we can expound on some of the topics that were talked about Tuesday evening. I came to Greensboro in 1989. My parents had moved here with my sisters and brother about 8 years earlier. And they kept telling me what a wonderful community Greensboro was. And after 8 years, it kind of wore me down, and the opportunity presented itself to come here. And I have always been thrilled with this decision. I think Greensboro is a wonderful community. I've raised 3 children here, and they all call Greensboro home. This is definitely my adopted home. I've served on various boards and commissions through my time here. Everything from being a Brownie leader, being involved in the church, working with the PTA, to being on the Chamber of Commerce board and the Airport Authority. So I have a lot of varied experience. I got involved actually in politics, the political scene, back in 1997 when there was a rezoning in my neighborhood, just like a lot of people get involved. And then things kind of grew from there. And I have been on city council twice as a District 4 representative, twice as an at-large representative, and now I'm into my 3rd term as mayor.
Chief James.
Hello, everybody, and thank you also for having me this afternoon. Also, thank you to the panelists that had the healthy discussion on the other day. I'm actually born here in Greensboro, right down the street at Cone Hospital, quite a few years ago now. I actually, on both sides of my family, have been here for multiple generations. So Greensboro's been home for a long time. Had a chance to go up through what was then called the Greensboro City Schools before it merged, and ultimately graduated from Page High School. Had the opportunity to go to North Carolina A&T. I graduated from there. Shortly after that, I actually went to work for the sheriff's office for a couple of years and got on with the police department. The funny thing, I actually majored in business in school. And a lot of people say, well, how'd you get in law enforcement? And quite honestly, I wanted to do something different, something that could serve the community. The other part too is, and this is what I always tell people when we talk about having a diverse law enforcement agency and actually a diverse city, we need to be represented in all facets, and somebody has to answer the call. So I answered the call because I felt like I could do a good job in serving my community, and then also add to the diversity of the police department. I've had some great opportunities here, but not just in the police department. I've had some opportunities to serve on some various boards throughout the community over the years, to include just a few: Guilford Child Development, the Malachi House, Communities and Schools. Learned a lot from those boards and the service on those boards, because it actually, even though I was from Greensboro, I learned so much more about Greensboro and the people that are here, because as the city has grown, there are so many people that have transplanted here, as we call them, transplants or whatever, but they've come here in various ways, mostly through the universities. And then also over the years, the immigrant community has expanded so much, and we've got so many new people that are here in the city, and it's given me an opportunity to really learn and grow with the city. So I've had again, a lot of opportunities here, and have enjoyed serving as a chief of police thus far. 2020 has been a tough year for everybody, but I'm still grateful and glad to be here. And I look forward to continuing to serve and helping to improve the community as a whole, and also to improve the police department.
Okay. Well, I want to start out our conversation with you all, kind of talking a little bit just about our own individual perspectives as community members over the last year. Around this time last year, we were starting to see these very high profile killings that were happening. And, you know, it sort of ended up with George Floyd, and then obviously all of the protests that were following globally, and also including right here in Greensboro. And then, you know, going through the trial and then the verdict, you know, I know for me, and being at NCCJ the last year has been a series of some ups and downs. There were some times when I was frustrated. There were times when I was angry. There were times I was probably a little scared, if I was honest about how I was feeling. And so I'm curious for you all, if you wouldn't mind maybe speaking to how the events of the last year related to George Floyd and some of the high profile killings that we've had, and just everything that has followed in terms of the trial and the verdict, how that has sort of just landed on you personally. I want to ask you to maybe step out a little bit of your roles and your sort of titles, but first and foremost, before you all are the mayor or the chief of police, you all are residents here. You all are community members, your parents. And so I'd like to invite you to maybe share a little bit about just what all of that has maybe meant to you kind of personally, and what you've been feeling over the last year as it relates to this. So I'll let you all figure out who wants to go first.
You'll go first.
Sure, I'll go first. Last year really was a horrendous year on so many different fronts. And when it came to the social justice movement, the Ahmaud Arbery case, I really thought was shocking. And I remember calling a really good friend of mine up, Black woman, and talking to her about her perspectives of the Arbery case and racism. And it was a really difficult conversation. And it's a relationship that I really value. And we had a difficult summer between the Arbery and Breonna Taylor and then George Floyd. And to see the pain that she was in, and it was truly a pain that I couldn't understand, that I took certain things for granted. And we had some difficult conversations, and we still are. But this was somebody that I'm extremely close with. And what happened last summer really showed that as close as we are, there are just some differences that we'll never understand about the other person. I'm pleased that we're trying to work through these things, because the relationship with her is very important to me. The relationship with our city is really important to me as well. On a side note, I was happy to see that the prosecutors charged the two men in the Ahmaud Arbery case with a hate crime in the last couple of days, because I believe that truly was a hate crime. Watching what happened to George Floyd, watching him get murdered 9 minutes long, 9 minutes plus seconds, was really unbelievable. And then we had all the social unrest. And we had 2 nights of, there were very peaceful protests for the majority of the time. And then there were unpeaceful those 2 evenings. And I wanted to come downtown because, I see this as my city, and I love this city, and I love the people in it. And I was asked by some community organizers not to come. I wanted to come anyway. And then I was asked by the police not to come, that my presence there would be more of a distraction if they were worried about my safety or what I was up to. And to watch those nights from home was probably some of the hardest time I had as mayor, not being able to be down there and to give words of comfort, to give words of support. It was an awful time. And it was also a time where I didn't know what those words would be. Mm-hmm. It was, it was extremely challenging. You want to make sure that you say everything perfectly. And it was hard to find the right words all the time. And so that was, I believe I understand. I did get some advice from a local activist who told me just to be quiet and listen, just to be quiet, listen, and learn, and not to try to insert myself in the conversations, but just to hear the pain and understand where it was coming from. And I really appreciate that advice.
Thank you, Mayor Vaughan, for sharing some fairly vulnerable experiences and times that you had over the last year related to this. Chief James.
I've seen a lot of video over the years of bad police interactions. Walter Scott stuck out from Charleston, North Charleston, South Carolina, where he was shot in the back. And I know everybody recalls that. The thing about George Floyd is that it was so deliberate. Even though I thought Walter Scott was very deliberate, but it was so slow and deliberate. And the look on the officer's face, and I struggle with even saying his name. I don't want to give him any more publicity, but the look on his face as he kneeled, on his back and his neck, and George Floyd was murdered right before our eyes. And that was tough to look at the whole video. And I spoke out about it. And normally, when we do a news conference, I'm not going to say it's scripted, but I typically have some notes, because I want to stay on track. And I remember telling the public information officer, I'm like, I know what I'm going to say. And it's the only time I've gone up and not had anything to kind of draw my memory or any bullet points. And it was hurtful. It was very hurtful. And, I thought about George Floyd in particular, but then I thought about the job that I have to do as a police chief and every police officer has to do, because, we often talk about the importance of having a relationship with the community. And you think to yourself, does anybody even want to talk to us at this point? Because what happens is in police work, something can happen in another part of the country, another part of the state, and that influences how people right here at home feel about you. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to try to get ahead of a lot of the issues that people saw in law enforcement. So we actually, the weekend after the first protest that we saw here in Greensboro on that Monday, we started looking at policy. And what I said was that, as bad as this is, we have to find something, we have to find a silver lining in it. And what it forced us all to do, and really not just as a police department, but as a community, it forced us to look at ourselves and see where we could do better, where we could make sure that we treat people more fairly. The other part that I wanted to address, and this was actually brought to me by the Police Officers Association, also called the Police Union, but they brought to me the idea of doing mental reevaluation checks every few years. Because as I looked at the George Floyd video, I thought to myself, there's no way in the world that officer could have been mentally stable to be able to do that. And then you wonder, is there something that could have been done to catch that early, to either fix him or weed him out, preferably weed him out from what we saw. But we looked at that. We also looked at the officers that stood around while it was happening. And so we immediately specifically put in a policy around duty to intervene if you see another officer using excessive force. Now, that was always a requirement, but it wasn't spelled out so clearly. So we wanted to make sure it was clearly spelled out. If you see another officer using excessive force, you have a duty to intervene. And we wanted to make sure it was there. I'll tell you, and I'll say this, and Ivan and I have known each other for a very long time. You become conflicted as an African-American trying to do this work when you know that a lot of African-Americans feel like they're not treated fairly. And this is what I've said to every officer, and I've said this at academy graduations. We can only turn this around one interaction at a time. So every time you go out and interact with a person, you have an opportunity to give them either a positive or negative impression, not only about our department, but about police as a profession. And if they have a negative impression, please, please, please don't give them anything to validate that negative impression. which means that we've got to treat everybody fairly. We've got to treat everybody with respect, regardless of the condition they're in, regardless of where they live, regardless of their race, gender, or gender expression. We treat everybody with dignity and respect. And if someone doesn't feel that way, we certainly want to know about it so we can address it. But what I'll say is, if anything good came of this, it forced us to look at a lot of systems, to include police. And I think we'll get into some more conversation about that, but it forced us to really do a self-examination, and really law enforcement as a whole. And if you look at even from a national level, there are policies that have come down from various states, and also on the federal level, specifically around police and the requirements of police departments.
Thank you, Chief. I want to transition us a little bit. So just for the folks that are watching, the plan is we're going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit and allowing the chief and the mayor to respond and share some reflections on the conversation that happened on Tuesday evening. And then we will open it up. After that, we'll move into sort of a looking forward, where do we go from here conversation, and then close our time out with the opportunity for questions and answers from you all that are joining us this evening. So Chief and Mayor, I'll go ahead and get started moving us into that part. On Tuesday, several panelists talked a lot about their work was really rooted in being in community, and being in community with groups and populations of people that they work to serve. I'm curious if you all would like to share any of the ways in the way that the city of Greensboro and the Greensboro Police Department really connect with people in our community who are most frequently encountered with law enforcement officers, or perhaps folks that usually aren't a part of our sort of civil community and society, in the way of kind of going to public meetings and all of that to get their voice heard. So how do you connect with them in order to understand their experiences and act on their concerns? And then a second part to that would be, how do you feel that those efforts have made a difference?
I'll start with that. It's very important that we have what I call non-law enforcement interactions with the people that we serve, meaning that I don't want to just talk to you when I'm responding to a 911 call. You really can't build a relationship. So we try to create some opportunities for communities to get to know us. Some of those are through community meetings or events. But one thing that we've done just in the last 6 months, we added a community resource coordinator as a part-time position. And what that person is doing now is they have built a network of community resource providers. And we've created a mechanism for an officer, say for instance, if we go to a home and there's an issue around, it could be food insecurity, it could be drug addiction, it could be a lot of different things that we as police aren't equipped to deal with. They can do a referral to the community resource coordinator. And then that coordinator makes an effort to connect that person or that family to resources. That's very important. Another thing that we have looked at is our response to people who are experiencing homelessness. We started the homeless assistance response team about a year ago. And then recently we started the behavioral health response team to specifically deal to people who are dealing with a mental crisis. And actually what we did is we merged those two teams, because oftentimes the people that we encounter who are experiencing homelessness are also experiencing some type of mental illness. So we are trying to figure out how not just respond to a call and do what I call put a Band-Aid on something. We're actually trying to figure out how can we get people the help that they need. And then that way, if they can solve that issue, then we're not continually responding over and over again, creating more police interactions that I would consider to be emergency type police interactions, and trying to actually get people the help that they need. But again, I want to go back to what I said first. It's very important that we create non-law enforcement interactions with the people that we serve, because quite frankly, I want to know you, the person that we serve, but also want you to get a chance to know me and understand that, even though I'm a police officer, I'm a dad, I'm a sports fan, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. That'll probably make a lot of people mad, but that's okay. But I want them to know little things about me that actually humanize me, and I want to know things about you that humanize you, so we don't always see each other just in the role that we're in.
This past year has been a little challenging, the last 15 months, because it's been hard to go out and, I like to meet people where they are. Not that people have to come to city council or to an organized meeting. It's one thing I pride myself in, is being accessible and being out in the community. Unfortunately, for the last 15 months, that's been difficult because of COVID restrictions. But we have continued to reach out to people and to go into neighborhoods and community groups, whether it's on Zoom or a very small gathering, to really hear issues that are important to our residents, to the people who live here. And to do that, I think you have to do that in an informal setting where people are comfortable, where they know that they can talk and that they won't be judged. The library, the book, which actually was the movie, they wanted people to watch the movie The Hate You Give. And then the chamber did some outreach on that also. The conversations around that movie and book were really very fulfilling. It got people in all walks of life to sit down and to talk about a book that, it was a made up story, but it was so similar to what we were seeing in our city and cities throughout the country. And through that, we had a lot of really good initiatives come out of it. And one was the Take Me Home program. The other one, a Love Your Block initiative. There are all different types of outreach that the city has started, but they were community-based solutions, what community would like to see. We also have the issue of, while there are some people who don't want policing, with the homicide and aggravated assault rate the way it is, that's not a monolithic decision. There are people who want to see police in their neighborhoods in different ways. They want to see them more often. We've had 16 homicides this year, and all of them have been Black people, 15 Black men, 1 Black woman. So how people want police to show up in their neighborhoods, those are good discussions because people want to see that differently. But the one thing we hear across the board is that people want to be safe, and that's really our job. We want people to be safe where they live, where they walk, where they shop, where they work. And that has been a huge issue this year on that, that push and pull on how police show up, what the funding looks like, reimagining. And I think we've come a long way in the last few years.
Mayor Vaughan, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I think about one of the things that the city did just about a month or so ago that I was really proud of, and I think I sent a note to Love Jones at Human Relations about this, but when they held the space for our Asian American community after the hate crimes, and the power, right, of just the city was holding this space to be able to hear. And I can only imagine if you all were able to sort of pull some things out of the Hate You Give sessions that happened that were kind of planned, what kind of raw things came out of that experience where some folks in our community that don't always get a chance to share, and that sometimes honestly are kind of overlooked in our community, the power for them to be able to have FaceTime with elected officials and things like that to share their experiences. So when you were talking about that, it reminded me of that session that was recently held. So
thank you.
I want to touch on something, Mayor Vaughan, that you kind of alluded to, and just in some of your responses. And Casey Thomas with Guilford For All spoke about hearing from about 500 people when they sort of are thinking about what their organizational priorities and focuses were going to be. And she shared that the top 2 things and issues and concerns that the folks they spoke to were concerned about was the need to feel safe from crime and violence in their neighborhoods. And then the second thing was the need to feel safe, protected, and valued when they have an interaction with the police. And you just touched on that. And when we think about that, there's often a tension that exists between people who are focused on resolving the underlying problems that lead to Black and brown people being killed by police officers at a much higher rate than our white neighbors, and those who say that the more pressing problem is the overall murder rate within Black and brown communities. So I'm curious if you all could talk a little bit about how you are attending to both of those. I think one of the things I want to talk about, and as we have this conversation, that this is not a we can only do one thing, right? Like these are very complex problems and we can work on both of those things at the same time. So I will let you all figure out what piece of that you want to take first, the overall sort of violence piece. And I think Chief James, you probably have some things you want to maybe share about things that are going on in that respect.
Yeah, so I'll start. The first thing I'll say is that, when we talk about violence in neighborhoods, if we want to go there first, the answer is not to flood neighborhoods with police. Certainly, we need police in areas that are experiencing higher than normal violent crime, but to flood the neighborhood with police, that's certainly not the only solution. This is what I told people. I've said this a number of times. If we went out today and we arrested every violent criminal out on the streets, but we didn't fix the things that are wrong in our communities, there will be a whole nother generation that would take their place. A phrase I've heard over the years when you talk about I don't want to get into another topic, but you've heard school to prison pipeline, right? A phrase I heard not too long ago was a poverty to prison pipeline. I think that's certainly real as well. And when you look at that, if you live in a neighborhood that has been underinvested in many ways, and not just recently, but maybe for multiple generations, there's high unemployment, there's low education, there are housing issues, things like that. Those systemic issues are going to lead to crime in your respective neighborhood. And then what that's going to do is it's going to lead to an increased number of interactions with the police. So I think when we look at the interactions with the police and people of color, then we also have to look at the systemic issues around neighborhoods specifically that are occupied by people of color. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the most impoverished people in our community most likely are people of color? And there are a lot of issues around that, and they haven't just manifested. Like I said, I've been in Greensboro for a long time, and they haven't just manifested in the last 5 years. It's been happening probably over the last 50 to even 100 years. And so we have to ask ourselves, we have to have policing, we have to do it the right way. We certainly have to treat people the right way, but then also simultaneously, we have to work on issues in the community. A couple of months ago, the mayor and I were at a meeting where we called together a number of businesses and nonprofits that work in this community. And we talked about how can we get resources to the communities that need them, because policing is not the only way to reduce crime. It's a piece of it, but it's certainly not the only way. So we can do more things than once at a time. We're working on, certainly there are some people that are committing violent crimes in the community, and we certainly have to deal with that as the police. But at the same time, we want to try to create an environment where the kids that are coming up in those same neighborhoods don't go down the same path. We don't want to have those negative interactions with our 10 and 11-year-old kids in 5 years that we're having with some of our young people now. We don't want to have those. And at some point, we as a community have to say, when is enough enough, and when are we going to change the narrative? And I think now is the time to change that narrative. I'll say this and I'll be quiet. I'm kind of long-winded sometimes. But, last year after George Floyd, it was just a reckoning of a nation. And there are a lot of people that made a lot of promises to even the playing field. Well, now it's time to see if they were serious about it.
Mhm.
If we really want to level the playing field, let's do it right now. And because I do believe if we do that and we do the things that we know can happen, we're going to see positive results, I think in the short term, but certainly in the long term, because what we do right now is going to determine what's happening 5 years from now.
I'm going to echo an awful lot of what the chief just said. You know, the REI training, Racial Equity Institute, talks about the groundwater problem. And, you know, so I think there are like 6 basic, you've got police, housing, education, unemployment, and healthcare, that you have to solve them all, that there are these systemic problems in those 6 areas. And, you know, we've made a commitment to look at the areas that we're responsible for, but we also need to partner with our county, with our school board, with the state, because there are systemic failures. And, you know, we see that on a daily basis. You know, we look at what's referred to as the crime crescent. But when you look at that area that goes through East Greensboro, that goes primarily through Black neighborhoods, you can overlap a whole bunch of different maps, you know, whether it's healthcare disparities, educational attainment, they're all going to be in that crescent. And that's really what we're focusing our activities on now. What can we do to greater invest in those communities, to start up businesses, just to build hope? Because, you know, I talk to people who really have just lost hope, that, you know, they may live in public housing and that's all they've known, that they really haven't thought about higher education or buying their own home. You know, this down payment assistance program that we have is a great program. Lots of people will qualify for it that don't know about it. You know, we have to tell people what the resources are to give them hope. I think that's one of the biggest things that I see missing in certain parts of our community, that we've got to lift them up and let them know what resources we can offer and how they can change their current circumstances. But we've got to break down so many systemic issues that have been here for decades. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think that as a city, we're committed to fixing the areas that we can.
Thank you all. As I think about, you know, the fact that, as you alluded to, Chief James, about the, like, we don't have to have, police are not the only sort of thing in this equation, right? Like, we've got our education system here and all of that. And so I guess, you know, the thing that we've got to figure out is how do we continue that momentum that everyone kind of came out after last summer, and keep folks engaged and accountable to that. And I think, you know, these are really big sort of inequities that we're dealing with when we look at sort of healthcare and education. And so I'm thrilled that the city is wanting to continue to stay in that, Mayor Vaughan. And so I hope that we can continue to count on your leadership in that way for that.
And let me just add, I think last year, 30% of our calls that came in to 911 really had some sort of a mental health or addiction component of it. It wasn't a policing issue, but people who are at the end of their rope, you know, they pick up the phone and they call 911. And I think the behavioral health team that we have in place, especially right now, is really going to make a big difference. I don't know if you want to go into details.
They're already making a big difference. And what we determined was that we spent so much time on mental health calls, it justified us having a specialty group that specializes in those type of calls. And the city hired mental health clinicians that actually are riding with the officers now. And not only do they handle the situation at hand, but the clinicians are actually following up to ensure that the people have access to treatment. And that's very important, because oftentimes we would, as police officers, respond to a mental health call. They may be committed or maybe not, and then they may never actually get the help that they need. And that is the only way to actually change somebody's life. And it's the only way to stop the repeat calls. And what I will say is that we certainly want to respond if there's a crisis, but if we're responding to the same locations and the same people over and over again, that's not a good thing. You know, and if a person's got a serious problem, it's just a matter of time before the situation escalates. So we want to try to find people the help that they need through our behavioral health team, through our resource coordinator, through our homeless assistance response team. We're actually trying to move the needle and really kind of change the culture of not just placing a Band-Aid on things, but actually trying to get people connected to the help that they need.
You know, one of the things that we're looking at is permanent supportive housing. You know, people who have been chronically homeless, chronically unemployed, that, you know, give them a place to live and then bring all the wraparound services to them. People aren't going to get healthy living under a bridge, living outside. But, you know, we are focused on a permanent supportive housing solution where we can get people the help they need where they live. And I think that is going to make a big difference to a good number of people. So we're looking at different solutions, things that the city hasn't done before, like the first responders and this permanent supportive housing.
So you all are already sort of touching on some of this, but I want to just sort of formally ask if there are any ideas that the panelists on Tuesday were talking about when they think about sort of police reform. One of the really big ones I think that sort of came out of that is like, you know, how are we dealing with these other issues that our community are also dealing with? So I want to just see if there's anything that was shared on Tuesday's session that you either think we're in the process of doing that, or it can't happen and this is why it can't happen, or we're in the process of working on it, or we've just got something different that's not even on somebody else's radar that we're working on to think about as we try to think about police reform and our overall community health.
So I'll give you an example, Ivan. One thing that we have done, we've continuously done this actually since I've been chief, is we've looked at situations where we don't necessarily need to respond. So we've looked at those calls, and one thing that has come up, and this may seem insignificant, but traffic accidents. We respond to a number of traffic accidents a year, and you don't necessarily have to send a police officer to do that. So the mayor actually has helped with some legislation that they're working on with the state now, where we could actually have civilians respond to accidents that involve property damage only, where no one's hurt. We spent about, we did the math, we spent about 17,000 hours a year on accidents involving property damage. So what that would do is it would, you know, the first thing is that it would free up officers to handle things that you really need a police officer to handle. And then also it creates an opportunity for a civilian response to an incident that doesn't necessarily need a police officer. So we're currently looking at that. They could also respond to stranded motorists and things like that. We're also looking at the possibility of, honestly, how to handle burglar alarm calls. And I know that sounds insignificant, but we respond to a number of burglar alarms a year, and about 99.8% of them are false alarms. So we're looking at that, but if you look at reform, even the behavioral health team, there are a lot of departments that are doing some form of that throughout the nation, but that's still kind of cutting edge stuff that we're doing. So we're still looking for ways to improve our response, but also looking for things that we don't have to respond to, and then we can be more intelligent about how we strategically police neighborhoods to do it safely, but to make sure we're in the right places at the right times.
We also have these clinicians available to the rest of our city staff. So
Okay.
if there's an issue at the library that comes up, you know, the behavioral health can go to the library, they can go to the depot, they can go, you know, we have issues sometimes with code enforcement, that we can bring a mental health expert out on code enforcement calls. So it's really looking at a holistic approach. One of the things that GPD recently enacted was the take me home policy. And it allows families to fill out a form if they've got somebody in their household that has behavioral or cognitive issues, and it is confidential just for police. So it could list what triggers are. If somebody has a mental health issue and they don't like sirens, you know, if they don't like to be touched, they have a hearing impairment. So it actually allows police to have some information in advance. It helps with silver alerts if people wander off. But this is a voluntary program that we have, that people are allowed, you know, that are encouraged actually to let police and let these clinicians know in advance what issues they may have.
That sounds really great, and something I wasn't even aware of, the Take Me Home program. So thanks for explaining that. I had that on my list of things at some point to try to ask and fit in. Chief James, I want to just say I also think, tied to the fact that you all are looking at trying to limit overall interactions, that has to be a really silver lining also for the team that you've got, right? So if they're not responding to as many sort of things that are like not high priority or that are eating up their time, you probably have a better balanced mental health wise team. You know, they feel like somebody's looking out for what's being put on their plate, those sorts of things, for them to be able to show up and be a little more energetic and have a little bit more excitement about their job if they're not having to handle every single thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on the mental health aspect, because I talked earlier about the first of the year, we started doing assessments. We do an assessment of officers after their first year of service as a sworn police officer, because quite honestly, that can be a very traumatic year depending on what you're exposed to. And then we're going to do it every 5 years. Now, prior to that, we had no requirement to do a reassessment of mental health. But in addition to the reassessments, what we also did, the city allowed us funding to allow officers up to 12 visits per year. Now, this is a voluntary program, but up to 12 visits per year with a mental health counselor if they feel like they need to talk to someone. Because we certainly want the officer that's going to come to your home to help solve your problem. We want them to be healthy mentally to be able to give you their best when they come there. Because when you're responding to multiple situations, seeing various things through the course of the job, it can take a toll on you over time. And we want to make sure those people are healthy when they respond to your home or wherever they meet you.
So I want to, in the sake of time, sort of move us into thinking a little bit about looking forward. And you all have touched a little bit on this already, but I'm curious, how in the ways are the city and the police department thinking about reimagining policing and doing things differently? I know you all mentioned a couple of things that you all have in place, but I'm just curious, you know, how is that process going? You know, we hear that term used a lot, reimagining policing. So I'm just curious what is happening within the department and within city halls itself around that. And then sort of a follow-up to that, I'm curious, are there opportunities for community members to play a role and help with some of that kind of brainstorming and be engaged in those conversations if people are interested in that?
You know, I want to give the chief a lot of credit for looking at directives prior to George Floyd, when the 8 Can't Wait campaign came out. You know, the chief and GPD, they were already looking at this use of force policy. And, you know, I want to recognize the chief for making changes in directives prior to that, and continuing to look at directives and things that the police force could do differently. You know, he was out in front of these issues. And I think it's important that, you know, whenever there is a negative encounter, that we take an opportunity to kind of debrief about it and say, how could we do things better? And I think that's one thing that you see the city and GPD and others talking about, how can we continue to get better and what resources do we need? And, you know, a lot of these programs and changes came from the community. So I think these discussions are very important because, you know, the Take Me Home actually came from a community member. Mentioned that something similar was being done, I think, in Fort Lauderdale. And so we take community discussions very seriously because, one, you don't know what you don't know. And people bring a wealth of knowledge and things that they learned from where they grew up or where their parents are. And, you know, I take all suggestions very seriously.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of echo what the mayor said. We continually look at policies, and a lot of the things with the A Can't Wait campaign, we actually had already done those things. Actually, earlier in last year, we had changed some of those. When you talk about the reimagining, the biggest piece is, and I'm kind of backtracking here, but the biggest piece is, what is it that we respond to that you don't need a police officer to respond to? And it takes some out of the box thinking. When I first got on the police department, everybody, it seemed like, was a sworn law enforcement officer, except for maybe the telecommunicators. But we had police officers, you know, working in jobs that clearly a civilian could do. So we started to slowly turn those over to civilian responses. But the other part, the reimagining, and I don't know if this really stays in that same line of thinking, but thinking about the processes that determine who you hire for your police department. Because what you'll see is that nationwide, the requirements and the background checks are not the same. And the requirements are certainly not the same. And making sure that, you know, you're psychologically testing officers, making sure that you are doing your best in your background checks to check for any kind of biases or anything like that. But again, and I tell people this, there are over 18,000 local law enforcement agencies nationwide. There are over 500 just in North Carolina. And so you'll see some things across the profession that are standard, but then you'll see a lot of differences and different nuances and requirements. So the level of policing, and we try to be the best we can, and we want to be a leader in that, but you may not see that same level of policing or the same requirement of the officers in other jurisdictions. And when we talk about policing as a whole, that's what makes it such a difficult profession at times, because when I look at what happens in other agencies, you say to yourself, like, you know, I don't think that would ever happen here. I hope it would never happen here, but we have a policy in place that says you can't do this. Well, that's great that you have a policy, but do you have the right people in place that are going to follow your policies? And do you have a mechanism in place to hold those people accountable for those policies, and a way to, for lack of a better term, help those people find other opportunities if they can't comply with your policies? But we're very serious about getting the right people on the police department and holding those people accountable for how they perform their job each day.
Chief James, I want to ask you a question related, since you've been with the force for a while. The number or the percentage roughly, you know, you talk about how there's been a switch to not have everybody sort of as sworn officers in the department. What that shift has looked like over the years that you've been a part of Greensboro Police?
I'd say now it's hard to put it in context because the city has grown. So when I first got on the police department, we had approximately 475 officers. Right now, at the moment, we're authorized 683, although we have some vacancies. But we had, I would say that our civilian force has probably increased by roughly 20%. We have a lot of people in place that, like for instance, and I say this, when I talk about the impression that someone gets when they deal with a police officer, it can paint the whole profession. But what I also tell our civilian employees is that you're often the first point of contact if someone walks into a station. And so the impression of the police department is going to be influenced as much by you as it is by me, because you're the person that they're actually coming to asking for help. But we've increased it roughly 15 to 20% over the years, and taken a lot of jobs that used to be police officers in those jobs, and we've actually replaced those with civilians.
So I want to ask one more question, sort of looking to the future before we open it up for our panelists or for our participants tonight to be able to ask you all some questions. So I'm curious, from your position, what do you see as the top 1 or 2 things that we need to do right now in order for us to see some results that will get us very different results than we're seeing now in terms of how folks are interacting with police, maybe some of the attention and heat that the police department is getting. And so in other words, just what do we need to do today or soon, rather, to create a community that meets the needs and ensures the safety of everyone, including our law enforcement police officers here?
You want to start, Mayor?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
It is a really big question, and you know, I don't know what that one thing is, or the top 2 things, because we talked about the whole groundwater approach,
Right.
And so we, you know, need to look at those systemic causes. I think, you know, one of the things that we really need to be looking at is education and what we do with our children, making sure that they're in good schools, that all schools have the same technological advances, the same classrooms, the same healthy schools. You know, I think it's important to really go after that young generation and make sure that they will be where they need to be at 3rd grade, that they're going to be able to read and, you know, succeed in school. We need to give people the tools they need. I think that's really one of the most important things, is to make sure that we shore up our school system. You know, we talk a lot about the pressure that's on like police and fire, the pressure that's on our teachers to perform with the tools that they have. I mean, I think we need to look at other, you know, other departments, other things as well, that we're not going to police our way out of this. I mean, I think that is one thing that's very clear, is we're not going to police our way out. But I think that we are striving to have better relationships between the police and the community. You know, I would encourage people to have, you know, if you don't have a formed neighborhood community group, then you should have one. And, you know, bring the police in and talk about what your expectations are. I think that's really important, to have those conversations in advance.
Ivan, I would say the top 1 or 2 things. The first thing is that, again, the non-law enforcement interactions and education. One thing that we intended to get off the ground last year, of course, before COVID, was the community classrooms. I know that a lot of people have apprehension around interactions with police, and we wanted to talk about, you know, what that looks like. You know, what does it look like on a vehicle stop? You know, because what I would like is some opportunities to have some open and honest conversation between some of my officers. And I'm not talking about me or high-ranking people. I'm talking about officers that work the street and some people that live in the neighborhoods. And I'd like for the people that live in the neighborhoods to have an opportunity to tell my officers what they feel like when they get stopped, you know, or when they see us turn down their street. And then I also would like my officers to have an opportunity to tell them, well, this is what it feels like when I'm stopping a car at night, you know, and these are the things that might, you know, alert me or whatever the case is, and have those open and honest conversations, because certainly we have to do a job, you know, but at the same time, we want you to go home safe, and we want to go home safe. And we definitely have to do that. The other part is that we have to get to know, and this is along the same line, but we have to get to know the people that we're serving. And we have to understand that a lot of people are in situations and have done things because they simply have not had the access to the resources that they need. And we need to figure out as a community how to close those gaps. Because I know, I mean, there are people I grew up with, you know, that were successful, and some that were not so successful. And the ones that weren't successful, I know the type of challenges that they faced, and they never got the help that they needed. And I knew them from, kids growing up, and I know that they weren't bad people, but some of them ended up doing bad things, because they were in situations. And we got to figure out as a community, how do we give everybody the opportunity? I understand everybody's not going to take the opportunities, but how do we make sure that the resources are there? But not only are the resources there, do the people know how to access those resources? Because there are a lot of resources that are not accessed by people simply because they don't have the knowledge that they're there, or they just simply don't know how to get to them. And we've got to fix that. And I think in Greensboro, I think we have the ability to do that. So again, I say, to those of us that made the pledges last year to even the playing field, now it's time to pay up.
I think one of the initiatives is, I think you're calling it game changers,
Mhm.
which is, youth employment, which is so important because, in the summertime, people they sometimes have time on their hands. So I know that this Sunday at Peeler from 3 to 6, there'll be people there. Maybe you could talk more about it. I know that there'll be resume writing
Right.
and, how to interview, but the idea is to get a minimum of 500 kids employed for this summer.
Yeah, so we're working with some community partners now, and we essentially issued a challenge. Let's find 500 jobs for our youth this summer, specifically targeting rising juniors and seniors. And hopefully, now some of the jobs, they may be retail or fast food or things like that, but we hope that some of these jobs end up being permanent part-time jobs even after school starts back, but also jobs that will put our young people on career paths. Because, there are a lot of avenues to success. It doesn't always involve going to a four-year college, so we have to make sure that our children that are coming up in our neighborhoods, that they have an opportunity to be successful and earn a living wage. And we feel like this is a way to make that happen. The other part too is, and when I thought about this, and we were talking about this a few months ago, the summer is when we typically see the most spikes in crime and the most activity involving young people. And we just feel like this is something that, not only does it give them something viable to do during the summer, it teaches them a skill, hopefully, puts some money in their pocket, maybe leads to a bigger job opportunity. And I think that I think it's going to happen. I actually know it's going to happen. I'm going to call it already. And I hope that is something that will be ingrained in our culture. And every year people will call and say, hey, when's the jobs thing going to start? Because this is something that we're trying to do every year for our youth.
And, and I think that's great that the police department's doing that. The Guilford Workforce Development, which is Greensboro, High Point, and Guilford County, we just opened a mobile career center, and it will be in Smith Homes on Friday. And so, talking about meeting people where they are. So, there will be people who are manning this mobile career center, and it will go around Guilford County, but it will help people find work, help them write up resumes, fill out applications. And so I think, doing more things like that are important. Again, being out in the community that you hope to serve.
Yeah, I appreciate what you all shared just then. There are a lot of similarities of what you all shared of the things that we need to do compared to some of the things that were shared on Tuesday evening, right? Like how do people have enough money to pay the bills that they have, right? And that everyone sort of feels that their life has purpose, and other people sort of recognize that, and we're not sort of willing to say, well, that part of Greensboro or those people don't deserve these things. And so, the question is big and the answers are big. And I hope that maybe the 1 year anniversary of last summer is the point where we can continue those conversations that started last summer, dig back in and really roll our sleeves up to do the work, and maybe pull some of the people that need to be brought to the table that have some resources and access and things like that to get serious about it. Because Chief James, I agree. I think as most things happen, right? A thing happens, we run to the table, we run to city council, and then it kind of fades away, and people kind of move on to the next thing. So Maybe that's our charge, is to use the 1-year anniversary as a means to be able to recommit and get serious about trying to fix some of these systems and inequities in our community.
I'll say this, it shouldn't take a crisis for us to mobilize and do something good.
Absolutely.
I look at when we had the tornado almost 3 years ago, how people mobilized to help people, but it was a crisis. But we shouldn't have to wait for a crisis to mobilize and make efforts to help our neighbors.
Well, thank you all for this first section of a conversation. I want to invite my colleague, Maria, to join us. And I think she's been collecting some questions, and I will turn it over to Maria.
Thank you to all our attendees for submitting so many wonderful questions. I hope we can get through a few of them tonight. And the first one, so one of Tuesday's panelists, Casey Thomas of Guilford For All, asks in response to the Chief James' point, if the answer to violent crime isn't flooding Black neighborhoods with police, why did the Chief and Council just push for more positions for the police and advance a plan to have traffic stops as preventative measures in high crime neighborhoods?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that question.
I'll repeat it all. If the answer to violent crime isn't flooding Black neighborhoods with police, and why did the Chief and Council just push for more positions for the police and advance a plan to have traffic stops as preventative measures in high crime neighborhoods?
So let me say this. I stand by my original response in saying that that is not the answer. But what has happened over the years, Greensboro has expanded, and we simply can't respond to calls fast enough. Oftentimes when, and I know most people don't listen to radio traffic, but if you ever hear the term 10-100, it means that there's a pressing call that needs to be responded to, and literally every officer in the city is tied up on a call. We simply need those officers to respond to the calls that are coming in a timely fashion. We respond to over 200,000 calls a year, and we have approximately 300,000 interactions per year for various reasons. A lot of that could be self-initiated activity for a number of different reasons, but we simply did not and do not have enough officers at certain times of day to answer the calls that come in. As far as traffic stops, that is not necessarily a strategy to stop cars in neighborhoods. Traffic stops is certainly a part of police work, but traffic stops alone are not a crime strategy. If we stop a car, it's for a specific reason. It could be a moving violation or something of that nature, but that is not a specific crime strategy.
And, right now, we're short, even with the number that was allowed prior to the addition of the 16. We were short, and so we're asking our police force to really make up for it in overtime, and it's exhausting and fatiguing. And we need to make sure that we have enough police, I think, so they can be at their freshest, that they're not forced to work this overtime in order to be able to make all the calls that come in. Because you can listen to the scanner. I listen to the scanner, and I hear the 10-100 calls. And I spent some time at Guilford Metro 911 a couple of weeks ago to watch the way they dispatch things. It's really kind of fascinating. I mean, if people are really interested, I'd say go ahead and ask if you can sit in and watch the 911 calls. You can do a ride along in that office. I suggest doing a ride along with our police force, because it really is very eye-opening when you see the amount of calls, the type of calls, how long it takes to fill a call. I think that I would encourage people to do that, or even to go through the Citizens Academy. But I think the ride-alongs are they're very valuable, because you can see what it's like responding to a call. And I would just make that suggestion. And I think that would answer some questions.
Thank you both. So I've got three very similar questions that I'm just going to group together so that we can get through some of these. So can you tell us what training is currently being provided to city law enforcement to help them understand implicit bias and recognize when it may be a factor before a situation escalates? Tied to that, what ongoing training do officers receive on bias, anti-racism, conflict management, et cetera? How often does this training happen? And so this is sort of related to Mayor Vaughan, you were talking about sort of looking at the groundwater. And so that there's a third question that specifically asks, what's the plan to look at the groundwater?
So I do want to say that in our last budget, that we did budget for the RAI training for the police department. And I think that's the entire police department. You know, in the years past, it would be, you know, a couple officers here and there. But this year we made the commitment to have the entire patrol division, or is it everyone?
And civilian employees.
Yeah, so we did make the commitment that there would be that training this year and follow-up training in the years to come. And we even talked about the possibility of hiring somebody in-house that would do that training on a continual basis.
So we started specifically teaching implicit bias back in 2015. So in 2015 and 2016, every employee in the police department went through implicit bias training. At that time, we also inserted that class in our academy. And in addition to that, we actually have contracted with a company, a local company that actually comes into the academy and teaches racial equity training. And we've also had a partnership with the International Civil Rights Museum for the last 3 years. And what they do is they take our academy through a tour of the Civil Rights Museum, and then they do a debrief after they do the tour. In addition to that, as the mayor alluded to, we've got funding this year, and we're going to have everyone go through racial equity training. Groundwater with the Racial Equity Institute. And also, we have been sending people to the 2-day course with the Racial Equity Institute for years now, as well as sending many folks in our department through the Other Voices program through the Chamber of Commerce. So we've been doing racial equity and implicit bias training for a number of years now, and we'll continue to have those experiences within the department as well as our academy for our brand new employees.
Chief James, that's great. I wasn't aware of the connection with the Civil Rights Center and Museum. I mean, it's a jewel that we have here, and it speaks so much, I think, to the Black experience during Jim Crow and civil rights times in a way that, you know, we know not everyone's getting that history as they go through kind of their education. And so I think it's a really important factor, especially for officers that are working in predominantly Black communities, to be able to understand where sometimes some of that hesitation may come for relationships if folks have not always had positive interactions with law enforcement. So kudos.
This next question is for both of you as well. And so what are your thoughts on the defund the police movement?
So, you know, what we have decided to do is to make sure that we fund community resources and police resources. We did bring on, as I stated earlier, the groundwater training. We are funding the mental health workers. We are looking at different programs. So I think, you know, I don't like the word defund. I think it's looking at prioritizing, making sure officers are trained. But, you know, we do have very real issues in the city when it comes to homicides and aggravated assaults. So we have to make sure that our officers have the tools that they need, and that the community has the resources they need. So I don't think it's an either or.
I think I'll say this: when you, if you defund any organization, whether it's police or anything else, the first things that you're going to have to sacrifice are training and personnel. We certainly don't want to sacrifice either at this point. What I do believe is that in many communities, to include ours if you severely defunded your police department. Some of your communities that already experience higher than normal violent crime would experience it at a much greater rate. So I think what we have to decide, instead of defund, we have to decide as a community what we will fund. And this is what I told people. If we do all the right things in our community, and as a result, people are living better lives and crime is significantly reduced. If you tell me, 3 years from now that, okay, crime is down so much that you don't need, you need 20 less officers, I'm okay with that, as long as we have enough officers to respond to the calls for service that we get on a regular basis. But I think to look at any community, and I think you have to look at it individually, if you are experiencing a high number of aggravated assaults or even homicides, you have to have enough police officers to respond to those type of calls. And I certainly wouldn't be an advocate to defund an organization like a police department if your city is experiencing crime.
And we did make investments in detectives and crime scene analysts because we know that it's important that when crime occurs that it can at least be solved. And we do have an extremely high solve rate. I'm not sure what
it's over 70%.
Yeah, over 70%. And I think nationally it's under 50%. Yeah. So, we are putting resources in detectives and crime scene analysts and solving the homicides and the assaults.
All right, our next question, Mona Edwards asks, what specific suggestions do you have to get the business community to engage long-term in working to address the systemic issues you've spoken about tonight and not just rely on local government or respond only when there is a crisis?
So one of the first things was the meeting a couple of weeks ago that we had with the business community, as far as, hiring youth to, it's really a long-term mentorship program. But aside from that, when we look at affordable housing and other initiatives, we're looking ways that we can leverage our dollars, that we can work with developers and builders that will look at putting units aside for affordable housing. That whenever we are doing something as a city council, we're trying to figure out how we can leverage our dollars, how we can bring people into the process, whether it's the business community or the philanthropic community or our healthcare system. That we are partnering with all of them to get better results.
I really can't add a lot to that because I agree with everything the mayor said. But what I would say is for our business community, invest local. Try to hire our people that live right here in Greensboro because the money, I'll say, especially for our larger businesses and companies, when you make an investment in whatever project it is, if that company or that contractor is not local, they're taking that money to other communities, and we need to invest it right here. There are people here that need work. We also have to see if we can build partnerships. We have an excellent community college system right here in Guilford County, GTCC, that teaches a number of skills. And I would love to see some businesses actually partner with community colleges to say, hey, we need people that can do these different jobs here. And then there's a concerted effort to try to provide those opportunities for our residents right here and hire our own neighbors and citizens that live right here in Greensboro.
And I will say in just about every meeting, our MWBE program comes up. And while we have a long way to go, in the last few years, we've made significant progress in making sure that we are investing in our minority led businesses, our minority owned businesses, and we are seeing a significant increase. But we know that when we talk about investing locally, that we have to invest equitably, that it has to be across the board, that it's not just the white, the majority businesses that are getting city contracts, that we are doing our best to reach out and making sure that our minority contractors are certified with the city so that we can, as the chief said, keep our business local.
So our next question, Cassie Reed asks, how can I, as a community member, be engaged in police accountability reviews? It would be beneficial to have someone besides the police policing the police actions. And a specific police accountability question Cassie's interested in knowing is, how are you measuring that police officers that attend the REI groundwater training or any training are putting the knowledge shared into practice?
Well, we currently have the Greensboro Criminal Justice Advisory Commission, which also contains the PCRB. So anytime that a person files a complaint on a police officer, we send a response letter to advise them of the how that complaint was handled. And so if they're not satisfied with that, the information to contact the PCRB or the Greensboro Criminal Justice Advisory Commission is in that letter. So they can contact them to have them actually review it additionally. Now, if they review that case, then they're privy to all the information available in that case. In addition to that, I think the second question was around REI training. How do we ensure it's put to practice? Well, so we have a body-worn camera program, as I think everyone is aware now. So we periodically review body-worn camera video. That's typically done at a first-line supervisor's level to ensure that calls are being handled properly and to ensure that that everyone is operating within policy. To ensure that specifically around the REI training that it's actually implemented. I mean, that's simply going to be implemented by, are we treating people fair and equitably? Are we being courteous? Are we handling all calls the same way? Are we exercising the same level of discretion when we're dealing with people from various communities? And that's an ongoing work and an ongoing check and balance that we have within the police department. Again, the civilian review portion specifically is around the PCRB, the Police Complaint Review Board, or the Police Citizens Review Board. That has been in place. It's been called different things over the years, but we've had a civilian review mechanism in place for as long as I've been at the police department, and that's been 25 years now.
And I don't think I have anything to add to
Okay,
that.
all right.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So is there any training provided to officers to help them understand cultural competency to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate services to the large immigrant communities? If not, do you have any plans to do so in the future?
So we have various classes within the academy that touches on that. The one thing that's very difficult for all of us is that we have, I want to say, over 100 spoken languages in Guilford County. I think that's been the number that we've documented for years. So it is difficult to know all the various cultures that reside here in Greensboro and Guilford County and the people that we have to serve. We do have language resources that we can call upon. A lot of them are through a service, unfortunately, that we have to call in a number if there's a language that we don't have someone that can translate. And what I would say is that it is very difficult. And I will also say that we need help with that. In a lot of communities, a lot of the, especially when we talk about many of the Asian communities and that speak various languages just within that community. Many of the African communities speak various languages, and it is very difficult. And we certainly would be open to any suggestions or any help from any of those communities that can help us to communicate better. What I will also say is that if there are any ideas of how we can recruit citizens from those communities to be police officers and have an interest in being police officers, we're very interested in that as well, because we certainly need people on our police force that represent all the various communities that we serve.
And we do have an international advisory committee, which does bring issues forward that they have within their communities. We also work closely with the Center for New North Carolinians and Faith Action. So we do reach out to immigrant and refugee populations, I think, to see how they can be better served, not only with policing, but across the board. And we have really ramped up those efforts in the last couple of years. And Faith Action had a press conference just this past week talking about the importance of having driver's license for people who are undocumented. Deputy Chief Ritchie spoke about his support and the support of GPD. So we do rely heavily on our nonprofits, and I think there is a good partnership. I know we have a language access group that I sit on, and it was extremely active this year in the outreach for COVID and healthcare. So we are trying our best to reach out to our immigrant and refugee community. And certainly if there are other suggestions on how we can do that, we'd like to hear it.
I think we have time for maybe one more to close us off. I think this is a good question to do so. Vanessa Haygood has a question that Chief James and Mayor Vaughan may both want to respond to. You mentioned that there are many aid programs that citizens are not aware of. What is the structure you are using to disseminate information about the types of aid and grants that are available to address some of the issues our citizens are having? Is there a dedicated newsletter or website? Is there networking with the community organizations to post information in common spaces? Is the information available through the schools? Thank you.
That is a great question. And because that's a question that we'll ask in a lot of community groups. How do you get your news? Because before we know we could go to a news station or a billboard, but now there are all different types of social media. So we have a very active social media presence. Our website carries so much information. Sometimes it might be a little difficult to find the information that it contains so much information, but we try to hit all social media platforms. We include we include notices in our water bill. We do reach out through Nextdoor, all different ways, even through church organizations that, religious organizations that we know have large followings. So we try to meet people where they are. But if there are other suggestions that we're not hitting at this point, I'd love to know it, because that is a question that we ask all the time. How do you get your news? How do you want to hear from the city?
We and I'll tell you, similar to what the mayor is saying, we use the same mechanisms to disseminate information. We use social media, we use the website. The challenge, what I'll say, that's really been highlighted this past year for a lot of our community groups, they are elderly. A lot of our most dedicated community watch group members happen to be our elderly population, and they don't do a lot of social media, if any. And so to get the information to them has really been a challenge, because oftentimes we would go to these meetings and pass out flyers about different things that we were doing. So that's very difficult. The other part that's been highlighted in this past year, especially with school being done mostly remotely, there are a lot of people that don't have Wi-Fi access, or device. And so I think we've done some work as a community to try to get devices to people, but Wi-Fi, as I talk to people, is still a challenge. And I think that we have to, it's a couple of things. I think we have to, as a community, try to figure out how to get that resource to more people, but then also have to figure out how do we get the information to people that that may not necessarily be savvy, technically, and able to get on it, especially our elderly population. So we do various things. I've started doing a monthly kind of an update, a 5-minute clip that we put on Facebook and Instagram to talk about various things that are going on in the police department, various programs. But the city website, which our website is connected to, is very robust, and there is a lot of information on there and a lot of programming that the city is doing. But I think that because information, there's so much information that moves so fast. You really have to make a concerted effort to go there and look for it.
And, you know, the chief mentioned broadband. That is something that we are looking to invest in to make sure that all communities have access to the internet. You know, as you probably have heard, we are going to get some money from the American Recovery Plan. At our second meeting this month, we're going to have a public hearing for people to tell us how they would like us to spend some of that money. You know, broadband was something that came up. If there are resources that the community would like to see, I would recommend that you reach out to City Council. We're easy to get in touch with on our city's website. You can go to one spot and send an email to all of us. You can zoom into that City Council meeting. It will be the second meeting. I'm not sure what the date is, the second meeting in May. So you can tell us how you would like to see us spend some of that money. We want to make sure that it's a transparent process. That'll have a dedicated page on the money that we're getting from the federal government and how it's spent. But we want to hear from you how you think we should spend it.
Chief James, Mayor Vaughan, we are at time, and I just want to thank you all personally for taking the time to be a part of this conversation tonight. For me, one of the things that I think is important for this conversation is the fact that we know the only way that we're going to be able to solve some of these problems is we've got to get proximate to the people that we need to get proximate to, and we've got to listen to what they say. And sometimes people are going to say some things that we don't want to hear, or that the criticism is tough. And so I think I appreciate you all being a part of this to do that. And I hope that we can continue to have conversations that will begin to move us forward and maybe not allow us to kind of just stay where we are. I think we recognize what has been going on in our community when it comes to really taking care of the community hasn't been happening in the way that is taking care of everyone. And so I'm just thrilled that hopefully this could be the first of many types of conversations that just look different in our community. So with that, I want to allow you all to say your final pieces for this evening, and then we'll wrap up.
I just want to say thank you very much. Ivan, I appreciate it. I appreciate NCCJ and the great work that they do in our community. And this has been my pleasure to have this conversation with the chief and with Ivan. And, you know, certainly if people want to continue this conversation, you know, reach out to me through the city's website. My cell number is 336-339-3607. I think everybody in the city has it anyway. So again, it's 336-339-3607. Feel free to give me a call or send me a text. If you send me a text, make sure you tell me who you are the first time. But we want to continue to have these discussions. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you for your time.
Just thank you, Ivan, and your staff at NCCJ. We really appreciate the opportunity. I think that we've discovered a lot in this last year. It's been a tough year, but I think through struggle comes growth. And I think we've figured out what we need to do. And the thing is now we just need to move forward and do some of these things that we know are the right things to do, that we know are going to help our community. And I think we all play a role in that. So again, thanks so much. And I look forward to future conversation.
Thank you all for watching and tuning in with us tonight. And I think we've got another program coming up on Wednesday that will be the final of these three that will focus on. So you've heard from grassroots organizers, you've heard from city leaders. And so how do we begin to kind of talk about what we've heard, and how do we talk to other people about that? So feel free to check out our website for more information on that. And please reach out to us if there are other opportunities that you would like for NCCJ to be thinking about as we try to be a community building organization, helping all of us in these times that we find ourselves in, where we are pretty divided. So with that, I send you all to your dinner or whatever you have waiting on the other side of this, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.